World War II was the largest and most destructive conflict of the 20th century. It was not limited to Europe alone, but spread across the entire world. On one side were Germany, Italy, and Japan, known as the Axis powers. On the other side were the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and their allies, known as the Allied powers. While the war was raging across Europe, Japan was rapidly emerging as a powerful military force in Asia and the Pacific region. Japan is an island nation with very limited natural resources, and this shortage pushed the country toward expansion. To keep its industry and military running, Japan needed oil, iron, and other raw materials, which it lacked at home. As a result, Japan began looking outward, toward nearby regions rich in resources. During the 1930s, Japan invaded China and gradually expanded toward Southeast Asia. This aggressive expansion alarmed the United States and European powers. In response, they imposed economic sanctions on Japan, most importantly cutting off its oil supply. These sanctions created a serious crisis, because Japan's army and navy depended heavily on oil to function. Without oil, Japan's military power would slowly collapse. Japan now faced only two options. It could either accept American pressure and scale back its expansion, or it could try to break free through military force. Japan chose the path of force. At that time, Japan possessed one of the most advanced and powerful navies in the world. Its aircraft carriers, highly trained pilots, and modern warplanes were considered among the best. In some areas, Japan even had an edge over the United States. Japanese military planners believed that if they could cripple America's naval power early, the United States would be unable to fight effectively in the Pacific. Based on this belief, Japan prepared a bold and dangerous plan. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a sudden attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack came without warning. American forces were completely unprepared. In just a few hours, several American warships were destroyed, hundreds of aircraft were burned on the ground, and more than 2,000 American servicemen lost their lives. The attack shocked the nation and changed the course of history. The very next day, the United States officially declared war on Japan. Soon after, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States, pulling America fully into World War II. This moment marked a major turning point, because the United States was not only an economic giant, but also an industrial and military powerhouse. Although the losses at Pearl Harbor were severe, the U.S. Navy was not completely destroyed. Most importantly, America's aircraft carriers were not in the harbor at the time of the attack. This detail would later prove to be critical. The Pacific Ocean itself played a central role in the conflict. It is the largest ocean on Earth, and whoever controlled it could dominate the routes between Asia, Australia, and the United States. Japan wanted to push America out of the Pacific entirely and create a massive defensive zone that would be nearly impossible to penetrate. After Pearl Harbor, Japan moved quickly and captured several key territories. The Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia all fell under Japanese control. For a time, it seemed as if Japan was unstoppable, and many believed the United States would not be able to recover. But this belief was a serious miscalculation. The next question facing Japan was where to strike next. Japanese leaders focused their attention on a small American island called Midway, located not far from Hawaii. Despite its size, Midway was a vital American defensive outpost and a key link in the Pacific defense system. Japan's plan was to attack Midway and force American aircraft carriers to come out and defend it. Once the U.S. Navy was drawn into battle, Japan planned to destroy it in a single decisive clash. Japanese commanders were confident. They believed their experienced pilots and powerful fleet would guarantee victory. On paper, the plan looked perfect. But there was one thing Japan had failed to consider. At that time, Japan possessed one of the most modern and powerful navies in the world. Its aircraft carriers, highly trained pilots, and advanced warplanes were widely respected in several areas, even considered superior to those of the United States. Japan had spent years studying naval warfare and had invested heavily in carrier-based aviation, which was quickly becoming the most important element of modern naval combat. Japanese pilots were rigorously trained, disciplined, and experienced, many of them having already seen combat in China. This experience gave Japan a great deal of confidence in its ability to challenge Western powers at sea. Japanese military leaders carefully analyzed the balance of power in the Pacific. They understood that the United States had enormous industrial strength, but they also believed that America lacked the will to fight a long and costly war far from home. Their strategy was based on the idea that a sudden and devastating blow could break American morale and force the United States to negotiate. If America's main naval forces could be crippled at the very start, Japan would have the time and freedom it needed to secure resource-rich territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. From the Japanese perspective, The United States Navy was the single greatest obstacle to their expansion. As long as American battleships and aircraft carriers remained intact, Japan's newly gained territories would always be at risk. Japanese planners therefore reached a dramatic conclusion. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had to be neutralized in one decisive strike. This belief led to the creation of one of the most daring military operations in history. The plan focused on Pearl Harbor, the main American naval base in the Pacific, located in Hawaii. Japanese intelligence gathered detailed information about the harbor, its defenses, and the daily routines of the American fleet. The distance involved was enormous, and the operation required absolute secrecy. A powerful Japanese carrier task force quietly crossed the Pacific Ocean, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. Every detail was calculated, from the timing of the attack to the flight paths of the aircraft. On the morning of December 7, 1941, just before sunrise, Japanese aircraft took off from their carriers and headed toward Hawaii. As the planes approached Pearl Harbor, American forces were completely unaware of the danger. Many sailors were still asleep, and others were enjoying what they thought would be an ordinary Sunday morning. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared suddenly over the harbor, and within moments, bombs and torpedoes began to fall. The attack was swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Japanese pilots targeted battleships, airfields, and key installations. American aircraft parked neatly on the ground were easy targets and were destroyed before they could even take off. Battleships anchored in the harbor were struck repeatedly, some of them exploding or capsizing within minutes. Thick smoke rose into the sky as fires spread across the base, and chaos quickly took over. Despite the confusion, many American sailors and soldiers tried to fight back. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and some pilots managed to get their planes into the air. However, the element of surprise was firmly on Japan's side. The attackers had trained extensively for this mission, and their precision and discipline were clearly visible. In a matter of hours, the damage was done. By the end of the attack, several American warships had been sunk or heavily damaged. Hundreds of aircraft lay in ruins, burned and twisted on the airfields. More than 2,000 American servicemen had lost their lives, and many more were wounded. The scale of the destruction shocked not only the military but the entire American nation. News of the attack spread rapidly across the United States. For many Americans, it was the first time the reality of war had touched their own soil. Feelings of disbelief quickly turned into anger and determination. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified the country in a way few events ever had. Political divisions faded as the public demanded action. Although the attack was a tactical success for Japan, it failed to achieve its most important strategic goals. While many battleships were damaged or destroyed, their most valuable assets of the U.S. Navy were not present in the harbor. America's aircraft carriers were at sea on training and transport missions, and they emerged untouched. This single fact would later change the course of the war in the Pacific. In the days that followed, American leaders assessed the damage and began planning their response. Factories shifted to wartime production, shipyards worked around the clock, and millions of young Americans prepared to join the armed forces. What Japan had hoped would be a crushing blow instead became a powerful rallying point. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked the official entry of the United States into World War II. It transformed the conflict from a regional struggle into a truly global war. Japan had succeeded in waking a giant, but it had underestimated the scale of the response that would follow. The events of that morning did more than destroy ships and aircraft. They changed the course of history, set the stage for a brutal conflict across the Pacific, and ultimately led to confrontations that neither side could have fully imagined. What began as a bold gamble by Japan would soon lead to battles that decided the future of the Pacific. And one of those battles was yet to come. In the early hours of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft rose into the sky and headed toward Midway Island. The attack was part of a carefully planned operation designed to weaken American defenses and lure the remaining U.S. Navy into a decisive battle. From the Japanese perspective, the opening strike on Midway was meant to clear the way for a larger victory. Bombs fell across the island, hitting airfields, fuel depots, and defensive positions. Although the damage was serious, Midway was not destroyed, and its defenders were still able to fight back. As Japanese planes were returning from their first strike, American commanders were already scrambling to respond. From aircraft carriers, positioned far from Midway, U.S. planes began launching toward the Japanese fleet. These early American attacks, however, faced serious problems. Many pilots flew long distances over open ocean with limited fuel, poor coordination, and outdated information about enemy positions. Some squadrons failed to find the Japanese fleet at all, while others attacked without proper support. American torpedo bombers were among the first to reach the enemy. Flying low and slow, they became easy targets for Japanese fighter planes and anti-aircraft fire. One squadron after another was shot down with devastating losses. Very few torpedoes found their targets, and almost none caused serious damage. For a moment, it appeared that the American attack was collapsing and that Japan's powerful fleet would survive unscathed. Yet these sacrifices were not meaningless. The relentless attacks forced Japanese fighters to stay low, defending against incoming threats. The skies above fleet were filled with chaos as pilots engaged in desperate combat. Japanese carriers were constantly changing course, and their decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Bombs and fuel hoses lay exposed, creating a dangerous situation aboard the ships. High above the battlefield, American dive bombers arrived almost by chance. Their timing was extraordinary, but Japanese fighters drawn away and the carriers' decks filled with armed aircraft, the dive bombers found their targets nearly undefended. One by one, they plunged from the sky, releasing their bombs with deadly accuracy. Within minutes, the situation turned catastrophic for Japan. Explosions tore through the decks of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers almost simultaneously. Fires spread rapidly, fueled by aviation, gasoline, and stored munitions. Crews fought desperately to control the damage, but the destruction was overwhelming. Ships that had once symbolized Japan's naval dominance were now burning wrecks. The speed of the disaster was shocking. In less than 10 minutes, Japan lost 3 of its 4 main aircraft carriers. Along with them went hundreds of aircraft, and many of the Empire's most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted in those brief moments. The 4th carrier initially escaped the first wave of destruction. Japanese commanders attempted to regroup and strike back, launching aircraft toward the American fleet. This counterattack managed to damage 1 U.S. carrier, temporarily slowing the American advance. For a short time, it seemed possible that Japan might still salvage something from the battle. However, the Americans pressed on. Later that same day, U.S. aircraft located the remaining Japanese carrier and launched another attack. This time, there was no escape. Bombs struck their mark, igniting fires that spread beyond control. By the end of the day, the 4th carrier was also fatally damaged and eventually sunk. The fighting did not end immediately. Over the next few days, both sides continued searching for survivors, retreating forces, and remaining threats. Submarines and smaller naval engagements claimed additional ships, but the outcome was already clear. Japan had suffered a devastating and irreversible defeat. 4 days after it began, the Battle of Midway came to an end. The cost to Japan was enormous. For aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and thousands of highly trained sailors and pilots were gone. These losses could not be quickly replaced. For the first time in the war, Japan's expansion had been decisively stopped. For the United States, the victory was equally significant. Though American losses were painful, they were far smaller by comparison. More importantly, the battle restored confidence after the shock of Pearl Harbor. It proved that Japan could be defeated and that American strategy, intelligence, and determination could overcome even the strongest enemy. The impact of Midway reached far beyond the waters where it was fought. From that point forward, Japan was forced onto the defensive, while the United States began a slow but relentless advance across the Pacific. The battle changed how naval warfare was understood, showing that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would decide the future of war at sea. 4 days of fighting had reshaped the course of World War II. What happened at Midway did not just end a battle. It changed the direction of an entire war, and its consequences would be felt until the very end. The Battle of Midway was one of the most decisive engagements in the entire Pacific War, and its consequences were enormous for both Japan and the United States. Japan suffered devastating losses that shook its naval power to the core. 4 of its aircraft carriers, the backbone of its fleet, were completely destroyed during the battle. These ships had been central to Japan's strategy in the Pacific, and losing them in a single clash was a catastrophic blow. Along with the carriers, thousands of Japanese personnel were killed, many of whom were highly trained sailors, technicians, and support crews essential to operating a fleet at sea. The loss of life was immense, and among those lost were some of Japan's most experienced and skilled pilots, men whose training and expertise could not be quickly replaced. For a nation that relied so heavily on precision, skill, and discipline, these losses were deeply felt, both immediately and in the long term. In contrast, American losses, though serious, were far lighter by comparison. The U.S. lost 1 aircraft carrier and several aircraft, along with a few hundred men. The difference in scale between the two sides' losses was significant. While Japan had suffered a crippling blow, America's naval power remained largely intact and ready to continue the fight. This imbalance began to tip the scales in favor of the United States in the Pacific theater. It also gave the Allies a morale boost, as the victory at Midway demonstrated that Japan was not invincible, and that strategic planning, intelligence, and precise execution could overcome even the most formidable opponents. The defeat at Midway forced Japan to reassess its position in the Pacific. Its defensive strategy which had been built around rapid expansion and the ability to strike first, was now severely weakened. With 4 carriers gone, Japan no longer had the offensive capability to dominate the Pacific in the same way. Its ability to project power across the vast distances of the ocean was diminished, and it had to switch from a strategy of aggressive conquest to one of defense. The loss of experienced pilots further compounded the problem, as training new aviators at the same level of skill would take months or even years' time Japan could not afford. The combination of lost ships, lost aircraft, and lost personnel meant that Japan's expansionist plans were effectively halted. Midway is often called the turning point of World War II, and for good reason. Before this battle, Japan had been on the offensive, rapidly expanding its territory and controlling large parts of the Pacific. The United States, although recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, had been largely on the defensive, struggling to respond to Japanese advances. Midway changed all of that. The battle shifted the balance of power, allowing the United States to take the initiative in the Pacific. It demonstrated that intelligence, planning, and timing could defeat brute force, and it gave the Allies a strategic advantage that they would continue to build upon in the months and years that followed. After Midway, the United States began planning its next moves carefully. The victory provided both the confidence and the breathing room needed to launch counteroffensives across the Pacific. Island by island, American forces began to push back against Japanese positions, using a combination of naval power, air superiority, and amphibious assaults. The battle also highlighted the importance of aircraft carriers and air power in modern naval warfare, a lesson that would shape the strategy of both sides for the rest of the war. From Midway onward, the United States was increasingly able to dictate the terms of engagement, choosing where and when battles would take place, and forcing Japan to respond, rather than act beyond the immediate military consequences. Midway carried profound, symbolic significance. For the American public and military, it was a clear demonstration that Japan could be defeated. That victory was possible even against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. It also reinforced the idea that wars are not won by sheer strength alone. Intelligence, preparation, and strategic thinking were just as crucial, if not more so, than the number of ships, planes, troops on hand. The cryptographic work that allowed the Americans to anticipate Japanese movements, combined with the skill in sea,